to Germany, which meant to us that the end was near, because there were a lot of rumors for 4 years under Hungarian occupation that Jews were being taken to Germany and murdered.
Eva Moses Kor is a survivor of the notorious Auschwitz, where she and her twin sister Miriam suffered under Dr. Joseph Mengele and his experiments on twins.
There were 4 of us in the family, children and parents. My mother grabbed my twin sister and me by the hand because we were her youngest children, and she was hoping that as long as she could hold on to us, that she could protect us. Everything was moving very fast. I was on that little strip of land called the selection platform, not longer than 10 minutes. And in my childish curiosity, I looked around trying to figure out what that place was, when I realized that my father and 2 older sisters disappeared in the crowd, and I never saw them again. So as we were holding on to Mother, a Nazi was running, yelling in German, Zwillinge, twins, twins. We did not volunteer any information because we really had no idea what worked in that place. We were extremely troubled, confused, and exhausted. And he noticed us, approached us, because we were dressed alike and we looked alike, and he demanded to know from my mother if we were twins. And my mother didn't know what to say. She asked if that was good, and the Nazi nodded yes, and my mother said yes. Then another Nazi came, pulled my mother in one direction. We were pulled in the opposite direction. As I look back, I remember my mother's arms stretched out in despair as she was pulled away. I never got to say goodbye to her, but of course I didn't really realize that this would be the last time we would see her. And all that took no longer than about 30 minutes. Miriam and I were alone. We had no idea what would happen to us. And all that was done to us for no other reason except that we were Jewish, and we really didn't understand why that was a crime. Then they lined us up for registration and tattooing, and when my turn came, I decided to give them as much trouble as a 10-year-old could. 4 people, 2 women prisoners and 2 Nazis restrained me. They pinned me on a bench while they heated a gadget that it looked like a writing pen with a needle at the end. And then when the needle got really hot, they dipped it into ink, and they burned into my left arm the capital letter A-7063.
The twins were housed in barracks according to age and sex.
We became part of a group of little girls, all twins. In our transport, there were 13 sets of little girls, age 2 to age 16. That is the way they housed us in our barrack, according to age and sex. After roll call, we would go back to the barrack for Dr. Mengele's daily inspection. He would always come in, dressed in his shiny uniforms, gleaming black boots, white gloves, and a baton in his hand, and he would count us. He wanted to know.
After breakfast, the twins would be readied for experiments.
We would walk to Auschwitz I and placed naked in a barrack, maybe 20, 30 sets of twins, for 6 to 8 hours. Every part of my body was measured, compared to charts, compared to my twin sister. Those experiments were not dangerous, but they were unbelievably demeaning, and even in Auschwitz, I couldn't cope with it for 6 to 8 hours. The only way that I could is by blocking it out of my mind. So even today, I have very limited information on those long hours.
3 days a week, the children would be taken to a blood lab.
There, they would tie both of my arms to restrict the blood flow, take a lot of blood from my left arm. At the same time, they would give me a minimum of 5 injections into my right arm. The content of those injections we didn't know then, nor do I know today. To the best of my knowledge, they were germs, diseases, and drugs, because the German pharmaceutical company was very heavily involved in the experiments in Auschwitz. After one of those injections, I became very ill with a very high fever, a fact I desperately tried to hide. The rumor in the camp was that anyone taken to the hospital never came back, so I did not want to be taken to the hospital. My fever was high, both of my legs and arms were swollen and very, very painful, and I had huge red patches throughout my body, the size of a small apple or an egg.
According to the Auschwitz Museum, at least 1,500 sets of twins were used by Mengele in his experiments. Less than 200 survived. Some died as a result of the conditions in the camp, but the majority died as a result of the experiments.
Oh no, they were truly monsters. The stuff that happened was horrendous. There's no ethical justification for most of what they did under the name of medical science. It was done totally without informed consent. The people used as lab rats had no choice. They were often killed immediately afterwards. They had the most horrendous things done to them.
In the sterilization experiments performed at Auschwitz, it was often the nurses who would select and prepare the patients for the experiments.
Then they assisted whatever the physician needed the nurse assistant to do, and kept it secret from the patients as to what was going to happen, giving false reassurance that everything is going to be all right, we're taking good care of you.
At Dachau, a variety of unethical medical experiments were made using the prisoners as guinea pigs.
Some of the cruelties are almost unbelievable.
They had a purpose for each one of these, usually to benefit downed German pilots in freezing water or some other battlefield result.
Author Vivian Spitz was an eyewitness court reporter for the Nuremberg war crimes trials of Nazi doctors. She refers to her book, Doctors from Hell, as she recalls the trial testimony she reported.
The victims were German, Czech, and Polish gypsies who were deprived of food and given only brackish yellow seawater for days, resulting in, of course, excruciating pain and foaming at the mouth, and in most cases, madness.
Many of these patients died.
They did experimentations where they would keep people in freezing temperatures until they were almost dead, revive them, and then expose them again.
Lower the temperature, raise the temperature until they froze and died. And then they took them directly to the autopsy table in what they called terminal experiments. And so they did low pressure studies where they took concentration camp prisoners and put them into specially designed rooms where they sucked out the oxygen, let in the oxygen until their lungs exploded and they died in terminal experiments. There were studies of bone and muscle and infectious diseases. They were trying out new antibiotics. So they took concentration camp prisoners and cut open and filleted and infected their legs and wounds to create simulated wounds.
We know that the sterilization program, the mercy killing program, and the unlawful, atrocious human experimentation program were masterminded, planned, suggested, implemented by physicians.
Dr. Joseph Mengele was able to escape from Germany after the war and avoided apprehension by authorities.
Joseph Mengele was the worst that we never got. Mengele's family was very wealthy manufacturers in Bavaria, and they managed to hide him until they could get him out of Germany.
Dr. Mengele lived in South America until 1979, when he reportedly drowned while swimming at a resort in Brazil. Finally, in May 1945, the war in Europe ended when the Germans surrendered to the Allies and the guns were silent. After the war, the Allies conducted the famous Nuremberg trials, and the world became aware of the atrocities of the Nazi doctors and nurses.
We don't know the figures of the nurses who were involved because they were the workforce in these hospitals.
Although nurses were not named as defendants in the medical trials at Nuremberg, the results of some of their actions during the war were brought to light. For example, the horrific experiments done on young Polish women at Ravensbrück and the killing of the disabled persons in the so-called euthanasia programs were made public. Nurses, however, were not exonerated for their crimes. Many stood trial later on, and several were hanged for their actions, including 2 male nurses from the Hadamar euthanasia site. Numerous subsequent trials of nurses resulted in prison sentences. At other trials, nurses were acquitted despite admitting their guilt.
There was a trial for the nurses, and I think there were 14 in all, and none of them were convicted.
The first trial of the first nurse and the first physician was in 1946, and it was the nurse and physician at Maseret's. And interestingly, both of them received the death sentence and were hanged. The nurses who were tried in 1965, there were 15 nurses from Maseret's to be tried. One killed herself the night before the trial, so 14 nurses were tried. And the reasons they gave were, I thought I was relieving people from their suffering. These people had no life at all. I needed to keep my job.
I think probably loss of memory and other things that had changed during that time. The nurses were not held accountable. And they used the defense, too, that I was only following orders.
Just following orders was not going to be an acceptable defense to murder, to genocide. And one of the things that came out of Nuremberg was the notion that everybody is responsible for their own actions.
But the baffling thing to me is still the trial in 1965 of the 14 Maseret's nurses. They had had 20 years to think about what they had done. Those nurses did not deny what they did. One of them said, yes, I probably killed 210 people. Now, the nurses from Spiegelgrün were tried after the war. Anna Kachenka's one of them, and received several years in prison.
Not all of the nurses under the Third Reich were compliant with the Nazi ideology. One Austrian SS nurse, Maria Stromberger, showed great compassion toward prisoners at Auschwitz.
She had heard some of the things that were going on at Auschwitz and just could not believe it, because she said, we're a good and moral people. We wouldn't do this. So she went and said, transfer me to Auschwitz. I want to work there. So her goal was to work caring for the inmates. Eventually, she gained their trust and would smuggle out letters, documents, photographs. She smuggled in ammunition. She saved the lives of many of them.
Perhaps the most famous of the trials held at Nuremberg before an international military tribunal was the so-called medical case, or the doctor's trial.
Karl Brandt, who was the chief physician of Hitler, said, I did what needed to be done. This was good what we did. We made German people healthier. So people were convinced that they are doing something positive in all these atrocities.
23 physicians and scientists were tried for crimes against humanity.
Crimes against humanity was a new concept, which was whether it be wartime, not wartime, there were certain things beyond the pale and we were going to hold people accountable. So genocide was a classic example of a crime against humanity. And so the doctors went on trial.
Today, many of these killing centers are memorials open to the public. But in spite of the bucolic